I just want to point something out, okay? First of all, you may have noticed that Charles Miller is not the normal NASA person, okay? That's because he used to be the vice president of the Space Frontier Foundation. And as much as anyone who wasn't one of the 3 founders, he was a founder of this organization. That said, you also want to notice that there are a lot of people from NASA here at this conference. And these people, they aren't here because they were told to be here. They're here because they want to work with us. They want to get stuff done in space. They see us trying to get stuff done in space. They see our energy, our vitality, our vision, you know, our innovation, and they want to work with us and they want to help us, okay? You know, I like to talk about the dinosaurs and others. You know, we can sometimes lapse into language about, I won't even call it the bad parts of NASA. It's just sort of like the, you know, the establishment. These people are not from the establishment. These are the warriors on the inside who are fighting for us. And we always have to make sure we distinguish and include these people in our community because they are absolutely the vanguard of our community and they're fighting inside the castle walls and we need their help. So Charles did a great job of setting up this panel, so I'm not going to have to introduce what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about low cost and reliable access to space and how do you get there. And we're framing the dialogue as what's in the way, what's missing. It could be something that's standing in the way that's an actual barrier, or it could be something that's missing that we don't have right now, okay? By the way, especially to my private sector colleagues here, you know, it is not just things that are right or wrong or missing with NASA or the government. It could be things that are missing from the private sector as well. Okay, things that we haven't stepped up to or haven't realized were are holes on our side. We're just going to start by going down the line here and ask everyone. You've got like 2-3 minutes. What's the #1 barrier that you see stopping us from achieving low cost and reliable access to space right now? And you don't get into the details of it, but point to what you think is the solution. So just give us a taste of how do we go about addressing that. So not to plan out the solution, but to sort of make sure we understand what the barrier is. So if we see what you're pointing to of an answer, how it helps resolve it. And then we'll do some more interaction, and then we'll have some questions or thoughts from the audience as to what they think the barriers are. So, Charles, why don't you get started?
Well, I'm here to listen and
Okay,
interact.
all right.
I'm not going to start what I think.
Michael, you get started.
I'm going to break your first rule and actually discuss 2 quick ones. I can do this very fast. As someone out there who's tried to raise money and everything, I see some of the barriers. They're more like speed bumps. I wouldn't say they're barriers per se. I think we still have a perception problem. If you looked at the rhetoric in the House and even in the Senate over the past week or so, there is still a strong perception that commercial can't do the job, even though companies that have been flying much longer and much more reliably and for tenths of government budget allocations. But if you look at what Falcon 9 did in terms of that perception, flying trumps all rhetoric. So I think the #1 thing we can do to overcome that barrier is to fly, baby, fly, as much as we can. The second is figuring out a way to get around this political process that we have where our entire space industry in this country is dictated to us either by the White House or the Congress. I think the easiest way to do that is figure out ways to divorce the capital that flows into the system and into the industry solely from the political process, either through innovative ways of raising capital from government sources, such as states versus federal, such as loan guarantees versus straight-up capital purchases, things to be able to get the decisions about what technologies to go for, what missions to go for, and how to go about doing them and what markets to go after without having to go to either end of Pennsylvania Avenue to get that approved, figure out some way to go it. It may be international funding. And that brings up one of the last ones is everything seems to be government funded and government directed. Let's figure out how to get nonprofits, NGOs into actually building missions and them making the decisions.
Okay,
So
Doug.
to just summarize, the political process that you have to go back and get permission from some political leader every year, or either from a proposal process, the budgetary, the budget, the way budgets are done, and NASA's under federal laws, is that process is a barrier. If there's other ways to approach getting financing or customer access that eliminate that ongoing repeated barrier of getting someone's permission that works for the government, that would be useful.
That would be very useful, and it's actually a problem that people in Congress have stated themselves in terms of how do we get NASA to have the stability that goes past each administration. Well, you remove the decision-making process from the political process.
Okay, Doug, do you want to chime in?
I don't want to say a whole lot, sort of echoing what Charles said, is we're here more to listen. But I think the range of activities we have underway now and continuing to demonstrate success and flying and proving that things work, beginning to demonstrate the existence of new markets and having successful businesses, I think will have the desired impact in the long run. I think one of the challenges is when you look at the business case for getting really low-cost access to space, it's predicated on certain elasticity of the market. And in the region we're in, the services that are currently sort of mature tend to be fairly inelastic, and the demand really doesn't increase, even if you lower the prices for a while. So for the existing industrial base, the prices would be lowered, but the revenue would be decreasing because the market wouldn't be increasing fast enough to make up for the lowering revenue. So unless you take a leap of faith and believe that these markets, which currently don't exist, but many people, myself included, believe will exist when market elasticity kicks in at some point, you'd have to make a leap of faith to put the business case forward. And that's difficult to do when billions of dollars may be at stake, and business decisions are based on less risky things when there are other alternatives, as there always are. And space investments are competing against a whole source of other investments as well. So I think demonstrating incremental success that can build momentum and beginning to prove that, in fact, some of these hoped-for markets actually do exist reduces the risk that other ones are going to exist too. So I think what can we do to continue to demonstrate this progress, the capabilities, and the actual existence of some of these new markets?
Let me jump in and just ask a question, because it comes up just based on what you just said. You're absolutely right that with the exception of the self-producing, automatically integrating carbon-based payloads, otherwise known as passengers, there is no market demand that's going to instantly come into being for a new capability that's cheaper when it comes online. However, there used to be a thing in this world called price competition, so that if you demonstrate a new capability that's cheaper than the existing capability and is as reliable and high quality, you can win business away from an existing provider. So isn't there some benefit, some ROI to an investor who can come in and launch, and this is what Elon is doing, okay? Who can come in and launch a GEO satellite or launch a LEO satellite or launch ISS cargo and do it more cheaply than the other guy? Isn't there some reward to there, or is that just not, is the market not functioning?
No, it is, and I think with the size of their backlog, you can see that it is. But I think what they're doing is competing for a larger piece of a pie that's the same size.
Exactly.
Once you get prices low enough, then the pie starts to get bigger.
Oh, absolutely.
And
It's just very slowly.
right.
Tim, I'm sorry, go ahead.
You know, I've thought a lot about this. I'm going to hit this more from the launch vehicle side. I do believe there's some sweet spots. When you think about it, you know, Elon's done some amazing things, but he's really done amazing things building a rocket out of the most expensive state to do business in the country probably, which is really amazing. And he's got to transport a rocket all the way to Florida, which is pretty amazing. He's still the cheapest guy in the country. So, and the labor rates and the state's going broke, so maybe there is a place for somebody else to come in, right? So, I don't think competition is over. I think the free market is going to be interesting as we go forward. I also believe that when we get in the traditional corporate world, I believe corporate greed drives the price way up. I believe that what NASA's doing right now with buying rides from people like Elon is very disruptive and good. You're scaring a lot of the primes, and that's a good thing. They're looking for disruptive technology right now, and they're looking for new disruptive models. And I know this, and which is good. This is good. This is a good stuff. So keep it up. But I do.
That's a message for the government guys.
No, I'm saying there's some good stuff going on. I'm saying that some of this parallel activity, you know, it's hidden business as usual. It's good stuff. But I believe there are some sweet spots in the launch business. You know, it looks kind of like Elon. It looks like he's kind of moving up the food chain to the higher profit stuff with the larger satellites. You know, I don't know that he'll launch the 1E. You know, it may just be Falcon 9 from here on out. So it's interesting to watch that. You know, and so I think there's a market. The question is, how do we get the range costs down? How do we get the government to change the philosophy for someone who can push through, you know, a production approach, if you will, for flight?
What's the barrier to that, Tim? What are the barriers you see to the range costs or getting the production? You were putting your finger on a barrier there, I hear. What can you clarify that? That's important.
Well, I think we're seeing some changing things. For instance, we're seeing. I think the fact that Elon addressed the self-destruct system, termination system with the flight termination using engine shutoff, that was a barrier, a hurdle that he went through with the government that we haven't been through before. You know, with the engine shutoff versus pyros, you know, blowing the rocket up. That's one hurdle. They're working on a new flight termination system that is, I wish it was coming sooner, but it's flying through a corridor, and if it leaves that corridor, then it would terminate the vehicle or shut it down. Those are the kind of things that we need. We need to get all that ground support out of the loop, all those people that cost us $2 million. You know, Wallops right now is a good place, not a bad place to go launch. We've been looking at this. We've got stuff that we're working. So all these, I think there is a place and some cool stuff, opportunities, and I think some of the stuff you guys are working.
So the ground infrastructure, the ops paradigm, all that stuff is a barrier.
I think so.
Michelle.
Well, as the regulator, the FAA safety oversight, I have to say, rather than a barrier, but a potential future barrier would be if there's safety issues. Above all, I think all the new companies need to have a good safety culture instilled as a core value to prevent that barrier. If there's a problem, if there's a mishap or an accident, it could have a cascading effect on the entire industry, investors. So I have to highlight safety as, you know, when you're looking at low cost, don't forget about the safety. Keep that as a core value.
Anything else?
Not now.
Okay. Mike. Oh, I'm sorry.
Thanks, Jim. It's good to be sitting this close again next to you. Jim and I were actually on the House Science Committee together for a couple of years, and I was.
When they were PoliSpace.
So I learned through osmosis, and also my arm twisted sitting next to Jim. It didn't take long though. Jim's he's very persuasive. So, but I'm Mike Beavin. I'm from the Department of Commerce in the Office of Space Commercialization, and I'd have to agree with some of the thoughts already on the panel when they were talking about a barrier, just being perception. We go through this all the time when we go to talk to people, even within the department. Our office is currently located in NOAA, and one of the things we're tasked with is to try to find other ways of looking at flying weather satellites, or basically payloads, not necessarily satellites, but climate change, climate monitoring instruments and payloads and things like that. So a little bit different maybe take on from the launch vehicle side. I personally think the way you lower costs on the vehicle side is just it's economies of scale. You need to have more throughput. But from a little bit different angle, I think when you're looking at say government agencies that they want to get a certain capability on orbit, but culturally they're just they're still in the old mindset where you have to build a big bus and hang all these Christmas ornaments on it and fly that, and they don't want to look so much at commercial, even though the SATCOM industry is well established. Commercial remote sensing is coming along, but there's still this sort of negative attitude towards commercial. That they don't go to the right places, or they don't have the right technical tolerances and things like that. But time and time again, we're able to go in and disprove those myths to them, and it's starting to gain traction. So we're looking at a little bit different side. We're looking at U.S. capabilities, but hosting them on commercial platforms, and slowly it's starting to take root. So we see there are those barriers out there on perception. The barriers on legal and policy and things like that. We part of the problem with our office is we're not very transparent. So people don't really see the things that we work on. But we were intimately involved in writing the commercial guidelines for the new space policy, and trying to change the perception, I guess, through the words of the president, through the policy, and telling agencies and departments that you really do need to go out and look at, and certainly the folks on this panel that don't need to be told this, but in certain corners, you really do need to look at commercial and consider it. It's not always going to be the right option for you. There's times when government capabilities, through just because of the law or through national security, other concerns, we still need to follow sort of the old space, I guess, paradigm. But there's a lot of opportunity here, and you need to start looking at this as just part of one of the tools in the toolbox, I guess. So with that, maybe I'll stop, and I'm sure Jim has questions. So.
Well, stripped of all euphemism, the problem's money. Okay, money solves basically all problems. It solves technological problems. It solves regulatory problems. It can even solve problems with the Congress, but I don't think I should go there. So since I went there, let me say that recently a senator said, we're not talking rocket science here, we're talking political science. That's a perceptive observation, and in fact, it is political science. Yet at the same time, even the best bill out of the Congress to date is focusing on dictating vehicle configurations. So the Congress, or at least the committees, are now considering themselves rocket scientists. And I just want to ask the question, when they play doctor with healthcare, or bankers with financial reform, auto executives with stimulus, how's that working out for the nation? So we're going to go down a path, if we stay on the road that we are currently on, that's going to produce another shuttle. And that's a 30 to 40 year step in the wrong direction. Robert Frost talks about the roads that you can take, the two roads. Well, we're just about to put our foot on the wrong road. Now, will commercial be able to pull us out of that? Perhaps. There's a problem which I used to think was the big problem, which I called the brother-in-law issue, which is, before I gave up talking to investors some years ago, I used to go to an investor or a venture capital firm or whatever, a company, and say, how about making an investment? And their response would be, oh, let me think about that. And then they would go ask their brother-in-law who worked on Apollo, because there's always a brother-in-law who worked on Apollo. And he would say, that's crazy. And that would be the end of the conversation. I did this for better part of 30 years. I'm a slow learner. Today, we don't have as much of a brother-in-law problem, but we still have some. Because as the Congress dictates technical solutions, as certain centers, try and fill their cafeterias, I have a lot of friends at NASA. I love these guys. Okay. But in the end, NASA is not an exploring agency. It is not a space agency. It is not a technological development agency. It is a public works program, and has been since the end of Apollo. And we have to face that fact. We cannot change that easily. We may not be able to change it at all. So in the end, the commercial firms eat the crumbs that fall from the table. So we either have to pile the table higher, or we have to be a little bit more clever about picking up the crumbs. And so that's why back in my T-Space days in 2004 and 2005, David Gump and I created a concept for NASA in December 2004, which ultimately became the COTS program. We had a couple of rules for that program. One was, and this follows what, Mike, you said about flying trumps negativism. Okay, you have to fly. You have to have hardware. PowerPoint will not cut it. First thing we said is you had to have fixed price milestones on Space Act agreements. Right? NASA was not really thinking about Space Act agreements. We called them other transaction authorities because we were working with DARPA, and that's how DoD does it. We said, do not go to ISS because of visiting vehicle rules and other complexities that would impede the success of the demonstration. We said, fly humans, not cargo. No rational aerospace executive looking at the problem would have wanted to compete with this guy's former company, CSI, because they had a perfectly viable solution that would fly, in 2 or 3 years. No problem. But people were the key, because when you change, you don't get press. You don't get on CNN flying cargo to the station. But you will flying the first human cruise. And finally, I said, absolutely no investors. So Mike Griffin came in and did it all wrong, except for the Space Act agreement. He got that right, but a stop clock is right twice a day. And so anyways, that's basically the end of what I had to say about it, except for one last very quick thing. In the past, NASA's been an unreliable partner. They're making lots of progress towards being a reliable partner. And I think that's a very good step in the right direction. But we have a long, long way to go.
I'm tempted to suggest that
the entire process of how NASA and Congress does everything, you know, is as a barrier. It's like, well, for me, gravity is a barrier too. But you know, we'll try to pull some barriers out of that. Charles, any thoughts?
Well, I'd like to focus on what Gary said about that NASA is not a dependable customer. That's a barrier. I think NASA acknowledges that it's not a dependable customer because, in part, it's the political process. Every 4 years, you got a new president. Every 2 years, you got a new Congress. Jim made the point, I think even yesterday, that a couple years ago that NASA passed some legislation, the Authorization Act of 2008 for NASA, that said that was supporting commercial crew. And now the same committee that passed that legislation is totally against commercial crew. So 2 years, different chairman of the space subcommittee in the House, and everything changes. And the people who were supporting Constellation and you know, a few years ago under a different NASA administrator and a different president are probably saying, you know, the same thing. It's like it's constant change. So it is a real issue. It's related to CRS, commercial resupply, to commercial crew, to anything that NASA might buy. Let's say some people are talking about propellant depots. The NASA buy commercially purchase delivery of cargo of propellant to low Earth orbit, and then use that to go off to the moon, Mars, and beyond, and to the asteroids. And it's the same thing for cruiser, for buying that. Is we could sign a contract, a long-term contract, which is what many commercial customers find is a natural thing to do, and then 2 years later decide, oh, we don't want to do that anymore. That is, that is a barrier. Let's not focus on the issue. How do we deal with that? What do we do? I mean, every investor of your company, if you come in and said that, is there any way we can mitigate that problem? You know, what are the ways around? Because the truth is, $19 billion a year comes into NASA, and as Jeff Grayson has pointed out, if you can carve out 1% or 5% of that, or increasing the amount of that to buy commercial services in a commercial manner, that's a significant change. Those are the crumbs. But then you get to the point that you want that to be, you know, investors in a way, which I agree with Gary, goes right to the core. It's about money. Investors putting money based on that you have customers. How do you make it such that that is a dependable, reliable market demand that an investor, a company can depend on, a contract you can depend on, that's such that you could raise money and then go execute? I'd like to. Does anybody disagree with it that that's a problem? First of all, I'd like to know.
Relative to commercial, I don't think so.
Does anybody think NASA's a good customer?
Yeah, I do.
Can I clarify your statement?
Yeah.
Having learned how to deal with NASA as a potential customer over the past couple of years, I think NASA wants to be a good customer.
We do.
Yes.
We see the problems.
Right.
With the system.
When under Space Act agreements, NASA can be a better customer than dealing with a prime or even some large, aerospace companies out there that have a bureaucracy all their own. So NASA is in certain regards, and would like to be a good customer.
How can we be a better customer? What?
I think to tease out the statement that you had,
How can we, have the people like Gary who invest all that time to go work with NASA to get a new initiative started, and then a new administrator comes in that doesn't like Gary, and the whole thing collapses.
I think one of the solutions is, and this was the assumption that was in your statement, was NASA is the one paying for it, and NASA is a funding source. In the same way that SpaceX is using TILE, thermal protection system work that came out of NASA Ames. if the money comes from somewhere else, NASA is a great customer and a great partner because you're removing that instability created by the political processes and the FAR contracting processes, that if you had some other source of that money, bring NASA in as a partner to help you do that. To go back to your analogy about getting crumbs to the table, let's go find another table.
Mike,
That's a hard thing to do.
The thing that I want to say about this is that NASA's a perfectly fine customer dealing with me. I had a wonderful relationship with NASA on the CE&R contract. $6 million, we were one of only 2 companies carried forward at full funding into the option period out of 11 primes. Great, they paid on time, wonderful. It was absolutely lovely. The problem is, I'm sorry, the problem is if I go to an investor, okay, the investor wants more surety than I can, in conscience, provide to him because NASA can kill me at any time. They can cancel the contract. What I did on the T-Space contract is I made sure that our milestone payments covered twice the amount of money I needed to execute the milestone. That meant if I failed to make a milestone, or if NASA arbitrarily decided to stop the program, I was still in the black. The investor is not in the black if that happens, okay? And that's why I don't do investors anymore. Because I cannot in good conscience go to somebody and say, put your money in, and this is what the result is going to be. I can't buy the insurance necessary to justify that to my own conscience.
But to some extent, investment is a risk. You can't promise investors that they will get a return. You can say, here is how am going to try to give you a return. Here are all the mitigations I have to all the risks. Here's why it's a good investment. Here's why if it goes any one of these ways that it's supposed to go or could go, you'll do very, very well, and in some cases will do really, really well. So I understand your unwillingness to go and put your good name on the line with someone. But I think we need to get the I don't want to say the end state, but to get the sort of state of self-perpetuation we want to see in LCRATS, it's going to require private investment. It's going to require money from beyond NASA. It isn't necessarily just pure venture money. It may be money stimulated by investment tax credits or loan guarantees or other sorts of federal ways or state ways of encouraging investment that's irrational without the extra help. That's all.
Jim, I want to believe it.
Okay.
I've been believing it off and on for 41 years now. I don't believe it anymore, really.
Okay.
And
That's okay.
Well,
That's fine.
But I don't want to belabor this particular point, but that gets back to one of the barriers that I talked about is before we even started this company, Masten Space Systems, the assumption was that the business was completely viable if I never sold a dime to NASA. I might have to extend things out a little bit to be able to get to some of those markets and some of those capabilities. And I've spent, a little over $2 million to date on the company, and I'm going to start flying commercial payloads within the next, handful of months. My investor is perfectly fine with that. Having NASA as a customer helps because, as you said, they're a great customer, they pay on time. But when I get into my planning, I know that that customer can go away. But I also plan the business assuming that any customer can go away. When I helped found this company, I made sure that if I lost a single customer, I could still sleep at night. And that's what I want to get back to. One of the barriers I think is out there is still this perception in the nation and in the world that space equals NASA. And if we can get rid of that barrier and say, no, space can be Bubba Jones Ford down the street. Space can be run by your state government, Space Florida, Commercial Space Authority in California. Liechtenstein can have a space program, which is what Bigelow is going after. Multiple tables. NASA is a good customer, but NASA should never be our only customer.
But for orbital,
Yeah.
I don't think that, I mean, for suborbital, I think you're right. For orbital, I think there's no chance. That's where the distinction lies.
Yes, but I think that we could go a long way by changing that perception so that and creating those multiple tables that we can mitigate the risk of NASA being unpredictable.
Okay,
Well,
Tim.
they're not unpredictable if you are in the engineering services contract. If you want to run a center, and whether it's whether it's a facility or those things are fairly good stable contracts. The NASA's really been a good customer for me, but I've been really on the crumb level compared to some of you guys that have gone after big contracts. You know, I haven't received big BAAs and things like that, but I have been a little apprehensive to rely on it long term. So an SBR is you run scared and you say, I got to turn this into a product really quick because there's no guarantees for tomorrow. So knowing that, you are, with me, you're going to turn that into a product. You know what it is. It is a short cycle. So it's not, it is, for me, you know, that's what we did. We turned a little product into a Bigelow product. And from work we did with NASA, the Mentoring Protege programs, it was wonderful. You know, and there's been other little mechanisms for doing work, Space Acts and stuff. So in some respects, NASA has got some good stuff that works really well. But as far as the long term, I can understand how to plan, not be able to plan around it, and I don't know the answers to that.
Is there something about how NASA or how the government, because I think this touches on what you were talking about with you know, the sort of psychological bias towards large environmental monitoring satellites, things like that. Is there simply just sort of a habitual way that NASA or the government thinks about doing space and launching, that unless they can sort of give up some of the assumptions that they have, you can't disaggregate demand for launch, and therefore you can't go to a situation where you talked about propellant depots this morning, Doug, where you can NASA can actually buy in a more market-like fashion. I mean, NASA's buying in a market-like fashion for ISS cargo now. Having worked with Charles on CSI, I can say that they didn't entirely buy in a market-like fashion, you know, up until recently. But is there something that NASA or the government can do, or that the political system has to address, so that NASA and NOAA can buy in a more market-like fashion? Buy access to space, buy space launch services, or the presence of things in space they want to have in space?
Yeah, we are working to try to do that. It's anytime you introduce new ways of doing things in a culture, you know, it can be a challenge. And I think something that we're trying to do within NASA in terms of innovation, in the same way that big industrial firms implement new innovation, if you try to do major innovation, major changes in some of your mainline activities, it can be very difficult. You know, there are a lot of antibodies in the system to switching, but you have to, and this is not just NASA, but a lot of big industry finds this too. You sort of begin with innovation at the margins, demonstrate success, and then begin to move that into more of the mainline, main product kind of areas. And I think that you know, we're continuing to do a lot of those things at the margins for NASA, and I think we have a real flagship success in a real mainstream commercial service with the COTS CRS model. And I think that's one also that NASA is really trying to be a good customer there. And just one example to underscore the commitment to this was a few years ago, there were some major changes that needed to be made in an operating plan after some appropriations reductions, and several $100 million needed to be found. It would have been very easy to take a good chunk of those cuts from the COTS program, but not one penny was taken from COTS, and it was taken from a lot of the other exploration technology and so on. So I think NASA in that instance really demonstrated the commitment to this, and followed through on being a good customer and a good partner in that activity. And I think another thing that is important in terms of trying to demonstrate to potential investors that NASA can be reliable is to point to areas like that where there have been success. And the COT-CRS model, NASA has committed $3.5 billion to buy firm fixed price services for those deliveries to station. And hopefully that will come to fruition, and we'll have that success to point to. But I think that's something that when you're speaking to investors, you can point to and say, NASA has done this. I mean, this is big bucks, $3.5 billion. They're committed to doing it, and they're looking at ways to do this for other things. So we're continuing to do smaller things. I mentioned the Sabatier reactor on the station. I mean, that's a critical component of a multi-billion-dollar piece of infrastructure, but we were able to implement this new model of doing business with that. So we're looking for new ways to do that. And I think part of the thing we wanted to do with that innovation issue on commercial space was to create an awareness of these things. But I think that's important so that when you're talking to the investment community, it's not just the cases where NASA has been a bad customer that they may be aware of, but you can point to the successes and where it has been a good relationship and has worked.
Okay, Michelle, you're next, and then we're going to go to the audience and start off with Dr. Moon.
Okay, I just wanted to comment on Mike's topic of that the perception is that all space is NASA. And I think that the FAA may have a role to play because the other tenet we have besides safety is encourage, facilitate, and promote the industry. So, we're here at the conference in listening mode also to, if there's ideas on things that we can do to help create the identity, the brand. There's been several instances through this conference where folks have brought up branding and getting commercial space and identity, sharing the vision with the public to gather more support for this new venture, sharing getting that word out. We're definitely open to ideas on that. I think that may be within our role and Department of Commerce's role as well.
Okay, Wendell? Oh, sorry, mic out there. There we go. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you could raise your hand if you have, then we'll get the mic out. Okay, great.
I'm Wendell Mendel from the NASA Johnson Space Center. I really resonated with Gary's story of the brother-in-law effect. It's exactly right. The other effect that you haven't brought up is a general lack of respect, and I would really call it a lack of awareness of the value of intellectual property within NASA. And it's not only within NASA, it's within all kinds of government agencies where an outsider comes in with a new innovative idea and the manager listens and thinks that's a killer and then says, well, let's do it internally because it's cheaper to do it than buy it from this guy. And the classic is the Bob Citron story of the Space Hab idea presenting to Bill Lenore. When NASA had an excursion into full cost accounting, it mitigated that because there was a cost inside the agency to do these things. And so you could compare the cost internally versus the cost of buying the idea. Now on October 1st, we're going back to a universal labor code where civil service labor will be free. And to a manager inside who has a limited budget, it begins again to look like, I've got guys sitting here, let's do it here instead of buying it outside. And that's something, Doug, you're going to have to watch out for when you talk about your innovative partnerships. You've got to make sure that the government side respects the value of the intellectual property that's brought in from the outside. And I've even gone to the point of wanting to add it to our ethics training that we go through annually inside NASA, that there ought to be a slide about that, about protecting
I like
intellectual
that one.
property.
So you have a barrier or potential problem you're identifying rather than being reactive in a potential solution.
There's a gentleman over here. Yeah, you're next.
Anything can happen. So I'm Feng Su. I'm with Space Energy right now, and I recently resigned from NASA as Senior Technical Manager. I have a comment and question for the panelists, and I heard Gary's talk and Charles, and I think I like what they said, but my comment is NASA really the market we ought to look into for the private space industry? I think that's the wrong path. We will never have a sustained space economy or space industry if we are everybody's eye look at the NASA as a customer. We already heard and we talked about the barriers and the whether or not it's a political science or it's a rocket science. Yeah, I agree. It's more of political science than the rocket science, because the way I see it, we have NASA. The big industry prime contract complex establishment is one of the problem, because it make us everybody look at the NASA as a customer. It's not reliable customer. We know that there's no way we can change that. So I wrote a paper about a year ago about sustainable space exploration, space development. One of my suggestions that's my question. I suggest NASA, like Charles Gary said, is never be should focus on the research exploration, but should never rely on NASA on the promoting space economic and space commerce development, because that contradicts its core function. So my suggestion is, do we think, and Michelle brought that FAA can help, but the FAA is really a regulatory body, agency. My proposal is a Department of Space. You need the Department of Space sort of partially fix the political science problem. Because you have to set up, always have this non-sustainable foundations, which the money come from, the part come from taxpayer. And you have the industry created around it and trying to get the money. So we're not really creating an economy. We're just using, Uncle Sam borrow money right now. So we're not helping economy.
Okay, but how does the Department of Space, how does that not just become the new government entity that everyone's...
No, because the Department of Space has a different focus mission. Its main focus is to help create an industry, incubating all the private industry.
Commerce Department.
I know, but commerce, they have a very little specialty and on space. And the ITA's killing us.
Hey, he's brilliant. He learned well from me, 15 years ago. No, I'm just saying is that the Commerce Department already exists and has that mandate. Now, maybe we need to give them a budget commensurate with the mandate.
Yes, so if that's the case, we need to create a designated government body within the Department of Commerce just to promote in space as an economy, economic.
So for Deborah Werner at Space News, comments on the record from Michael Beavin, on his budget being multiplied by 100. I'm sure.
I think it's wrong. Everybody look at NASA as a customer. You will never create a sustainable economy.
Okay, fine.
I want to address, there's a misconception here, why we're here. The people in NASA, and there's various people in the room here from the centers, would love it if the commercial industry came to the table and we found all these other customers and you're just our second or third or fourth customer. They hate being the only customer, and they sometimes understand that that's just a fact of life, that they're the only customer for a certain type of service. But they love it when you come to the table with other customers. NASA would love to facilitate or help that, but we have nothing to add if we're a pure commercial business with other customers. So that's not the issue here. We're trying, from our perspective, our little piece of the world, and we would love it when we're just a smaller and smaller piece of an ever-growing pie. $261 billion a year last year in commercial space revenues. We love that. But in our part of the world, what we can do, challenged by the president, to foster new commercial industries, we're here to have that conversation. How can we be more effective in helping this?
Okay, Jonathan Cart. Then I have a question from the internet.
Then I'll stick to this, my more important question. How serious is the FCC and ITU registration process as a barrier to putting up space technology and putting up spacecraft?
I have no idea. Oh, yes. Yes, absolutely.
Well, it is a barrier. You know, everything costs money. Even if you want to have a commercial remote sensing satellite, you have to license it through NOAA. And we like to say the license is free, right? But you still got to go pay the lawyers to put that license together for you. And you have to go through the interagency process to get approval for whatever resolution that you want to try to do that at. You know, the FCC, hey, I worked for the Satellite Industry Association for a long time, and we did a ton of regulatory stuff, and it's still a mystery to me how it really works over there. But it is a barrier. You're right. You know, and are there things that we can do to try to reduce that? Yes, there are, and folks are looking at that along with export control reform and other areas to try to bring down a lot of the, quite frankly, what we're talking about today, a lot of the barriers that are out there for people to do things in space. And maybe it's not directly applicable to, say, building rockets, but you know, once we get there, we got to do stuff, and we got to make money, and so that's sort of the goal.
Okay, we have a question from the internet. Quote, so why is NASA under the influence of constant change when it seems other agencies are not? Unquote. And this is from Snow Rider. Okay. I think that I just as someone who's worked in Washington for a very long time, much longer than I care to admit, other agencies are subject to change, substantial change. However, NASA is in the business of doing new things. So one should presume that NASA is going to be a somewhat dynamic organization with somewhat dynamic goals, you know, that are progressing over time. I will suggest that the barrier that comes out of this question is that when NASA works very hard to try to set up a new paradigm like this COT-CRS partnership or something like that, that we in industry need to do a better job of working with NASA to communicate the expectations and the benefits of that new arrangement to the various and sundry oversight committees and policymakers that are overseeing it. The administration, and I would argue those of us on the outside, certainly didn't prepare the battle space very well for this year's discussion. Now, we thought, perhaps naively, that the most public, most transparent policy debate and technical debate and funding debate about what we can and cannot do in human spaceflight, i.e. the Augustine Committee, sort of did, in fact, sort of was sufficient, okay? Apparently it wasn't, because there were a lot of people who just didn't want to listen. As these good people inside NASA, both on the stage and in the audience and from other agencies, are working to try to make these new paradigms work, we're going to have to do a better job of working with them to articulate all the reasons, because there's no question that the folks whose oxes are gored by these new ways of doing business are doing a very good job of communicating why these new ideas won't work, are terrible, are awful, are privatizing the Marine Corps, et cetera, okay? So That's a thought. Jeff, and then you.
So returning to the question of what are sources of more tables and crumbs, and Mike, you're exactly on the right track when you're saying let's not just rely on federal, you mentioned state. So I would say let's get even more granular than that. When you're thinking about sources of tables and crumbs and you're going into states, think regionally, even think down to the county level. Most counties, most regions have economic development partnerships, economic development organizations. There are a tremendous number of workforce development grants found from foundations spread all around this country that are regionally focused and county focused. Those are sources. Last comment, you cannot get away from the concern about science, technology, education, and math, STEM education. There is a lot of money, a lot of sources, a lot of foundations in many places around this country. Find ways to connect what you're doing with workforce development, job creation, targeted industry development in those communities, STEM education. You may find interest, attention, and money that you're not aware of because otherwise they're not aware of what you're capable of creating. So just some ideas. Thank you.
I'd like, since we have limited time here, I'd like to bring us back to what the core question here is we want to get out of this. It's, and forgive me for picking on my good friend Jeff, the key barrier to achieving low-cost, reliable access to space, which is a huge challenge and would transform everything, is not getting more economic help from local communities. Okay, that's not going to change it. If for this community and those who want to talk, what is the one or two things, and if you can focus on one thing that if we change could make a major change in helping this nation achieve low-cost, reliable access to space. When I say low-cost, reliable access to space, I mean an order of magnitude reduction in cost and an order of magnitude increase in reliability over and above what we have today. If you could do one or two things, fix one or two barriers, like you fix that, and that would be critical, maybe be the thing that we could give the nation that capability. That's what the purpose of this conversation is about.
Does someone want to respond to that?
I think we're getting off track of the original purpose of this conversation. I want to get us back on track. That's what we're here for.
Okay, it seems to me, and maybe it's blatantly obvious, but the number one barrier is low volume. Total number of launches worldwide is less than 100. Now, none of the applications that we're doing today need high volume. There are two applications that I see, and I'm sure everybody knows them, there's our tourism and space solar power that really could use tens of thousands of launches per year.
It's market. It's the market issue.
And then the next, now the Obama administration's proposal for private space launch is exactly what tourism needs. So that, we have to win that fight. And the other one, space solar power, the question I have is, how do we get that in the game? Because right now in the government, it's not even in the game. It's not in the game in the discussion of energy. It's just not there. And what do we do to get that second application? Because you don't want to depend on a single application, right? And the last thing is maybe there's a third application that I don't know what it is.
Okay. Next
Thank
person.
you. Go ahead.
Let me do one more. I agree the market is probably the number one driver in the volume associated with the market. But number two is the U.S. competitiveness in the world launch space. I believe there are processes and bureaucracies and things here in the U.S. that limit our ability to compete from a launch process with other countries. And that is something that we're going to see continue to grow as other countries.
Are you talking about ITAR? What do you specifically what do you mean?
And process. You know, we don't want to take risks, so we have a lot more safety issues. We have more launch restraint issues. The ground operations. You know, we have a few bases that have overheads associated with them that drive up costs significantly, and the time to get to launch significantly. So we've lost most of the commercial launch capability in the U.S. to other countries. Elon is trying to get that back, but still the price point is going to keep coming down. So he won't.
Jim Ball, you were pointing to someone over there? Deborah.
So the number one thing the government should do is get out of the business of being a competitor. I think we're at the point in launch where we do have a lot of options. Even EELV can be a commercial service. It started out that way. It's provided by commercially run companies, public companies. There is capability out there. We have lots of choices. So the focus on continuing to fund things that are choosing to make them inherently government, and Wendell's comment about when the government labor becomes free, then the government really is more of a competitor to industry because we can't compete with free labor. So take those costs and save them by investing in the payloads and in how we're using space, small satellites, small payloads. It doesn't have to be big things. It doesn't have to be Battlestar Galactica. Use what we've got, stimulate the small side. And remember, all of those big companies all started out small. Boeing didn't start out as a multi-billion-dollar company. It started out in a little red barn in Seattle. And in fact, they were doing furniture and bootlegging liquor across the border. So, the entrepreneurs and innovation is where this country came from. Let that happen. Let the free market do it. That's what America's all about. And government stop competing with industry. Put the money in the far technologies where industry can't afford the risk or the payback, and that will help us get somewhere.
Okay, Charles, Doug, we're at the end of our hour. Is there anything you guys want to say to wrap up, or do you want one more person to speak?
Well, just real quickly with what Deborah was saying, that's precisely what we're trying to do with the budget request for 2011.
And I'll say what Doug can't say. If you watch the House, our government has explicitly said we don't want to do that. We want to compete and put you out of business. That's what the House just said last week. We can't accept that.
Well, I don't think they believe us yet, y'all. So we just got to keep flying. I think the suborbital tourism will get people used to the idea that we're real. We're still new at this, guys. So I think that's what we're at. Nobody believes us yet. Okay? So we got to fly. We got to get some stuff in the air.
First of all, I want to thank everybody here for this conversation, and I am looking forward that maybe in the future this is a good forum for a open, transparent discussion with this community and the government about space policy challenges, issues. And I'd like to give the remaining balance of my time to Rick Tomlinson to make one final comment and then close out this panel, since he was raising his hand.
First of all, I want to acknowledge Charles. Sorry. Because Charles actually said something in the 90s that was critical and important, and he's doing it now. Charles introduced the phrase, the foundation of changing the conversation about space. And that was your baby. And that's what you're doing right here. And I think that's critical and that's important. You also have to change who's in the conversation and what the direction of the conversation is and why you're having the conversation. And very quickly, I spent 2 years working for Virginia and the county of Accomack, where Wallops is located, trying to get NewSpace companies to come out there, and suborbital companies. And we were read lectures by people who said, well, the range costs are $100,000 and this and that and the other. Come to find out what's happening, and it goes back to Deborah's point, in the suborbital realm, was there's a sounding rocket group of people at Wallops have a vested interest in launching sounding rockets, and that's their world, that's their heritage. And here come these NewSpace companies that want to do suborbital stuff, and so they're threatened by that. I would suggest internally within NASA, first of all, private sector is going to do its own thing in the private sector. We're only talking about the intersection of the private sector and the government here. Within NASA, have a conversation when you come out with this idea at a top level where you look strategically within NASA. Who within NASA is going to be threatened by this new initiative? Who is going to benefit by it? And how can we bring them in? Go in there, these people who are launching sounding rockets, or the payload carrier, the people that are providing the payloads. Find out how they can engage in a conversation with the private firms and put their interest in alignment with what the private firms can provide, rather than making a top-down pronouncement and then some part of NASA feels threatened and goes to war and calls up, I won't say officially calls up, but somehow staffers find out about it and then try and kill in the defense. Put them in the loop, get them engaged in the conversation. because that way you can bring everybody up. There's no reason to have people doing human spacecraft at the space station and NASA supporting something like Orion, which hurts it. You've got to change the internal conversation, who's involved. But I want to celebrate you guys for being here. I think it's fantastic what you're doing, and I hope we can do this every year here because it's great. And thank you guys.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you again to all our panelists. I think this was a great discussion, which we will be continuing after what will now be a 5-minute coffee break. So please go down, grab your coffee, and we will be getting started very promptly. Thank you.